gentlemen, if you could please take your seats and we'll commence in about 60 seconds. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let me give you a warm welcome to our FSI workshop number 2. And it's a pleasure to see many of you that came for our first workshop about 3 months ago. Today is a fairly intense day, but it should be quite an interesting and not only educational but insightful day of giving feedback based on the interim report that the Financial System Inquiry has released recently. The Centre for International Finance and Regulation commenced about 2 years ago. It's led by UNSW and it has a consortium group of 6 universities, some industry partners, and it's principally funded by the Commonwealth and New South Wales state governments. And the purpose of CIFR is to be industry engaged and advocating in terms of public policy contribution in the financial services domain. And the purpose of today is to help to inform the FSI Secretariat on the interim report and to hear both academic and industry views. And we're also today pleased to offer interactive technology, which we'll explain shortly, which is designed to provide direct feedback on the interim report and what is heard today. The financial systems are incredibly important, and we have in Australia a very robust, stable, effective and healthy system. It's about 17 years since the last Financial System Inquiry, the Wallace Inquiry, was established. The final report that the FSI Secretariat will release is, I think it's in November this year. It's also fantastic that we have on our program today a large number of participants, all experts in their field, both in academia and in industry. I'm also very pleased that we could have David Murray with us, who will be speaking shortly. Also we have Professor Fred Hilmer, who will be speaking on competition, and Mark Johnson later today in terms of implementation. And we have a star-studded lineup, and it's great that we could have everyone involved. I'd also like to thank quickly my team members. They've pulled this together, fantastic job, and it's a pleasure working with you. So without further ado, please let me introduce my colleague Anthony Lane, who is serving as a consultant with CIFR, has helped us strategically with today's proceedings and is helping CIFR with our submission document to the FSI. Anthony Lane.
Thanks, David, and good morning, everyone. I'm just going to run through some of the formalities, a little bit about the interactive component of today's event, and just make some comments about some of the materials in your pack before we move on. Some of the basics, you probably noticed the sign to the bathroom. As you head out, it's to the left of the elevators. On your way out, just watch your step as you head out the door. I stood out there a little while and just about everybody tripped over the cord that's covered up, but not covered up quite well enough. So just be mindful of that. With the phones, we're going to be using them today, so please keep them on, but put them on silent mode so that they don't interrupt proceedings. I'm advised that the mobile data reception is not too good here, so you're encouraged to use the local Wi-Fi. And if you look in the audience engagement document, I think it's page 5, down the bottom, there's details about accessing the Hilton's free Wi-Fi. There's an access code there. You'll need that access code, not a conference code. And that will also allow you to register your responses to our questions. There is a coffee machine outside for if you're like me and you can't go for too long without a shot of caffeine. That will be available all day. In terms of breaks, we're going to have the breaks in the foyer in the morning and in the afternoon. The lunch will be served in here, and we've got some videos to screen during the lunch. As you'll see from the program, it's what I think of as a pretty brisk pace to ask people who are experts in their field, passionate about the subject matter, to present in around 15 minutes. It's no small feat. So we'll be moving pretty quickly through the agenda. For that reason, we'll dispense with talking about people's histories and experience, etc. All the bios are in the packages that you have. There will be refreshments at the end of the day after the closing remarks as well. For the speakers, just so you know, you'll get a reminder around the 10-minute mark, another one around the 12-minute mark, and for most but not all of the speakers, there'll be a question put to the audience within that 15-minute time frame. And in terms of the interactive component, the audience engagement document at page 5 gives you the information if you want to send out a tweet today during the course of proceedings. If you want to participate, we encourage you to participate by way of responding to the questions that we'll ask. As David mentioned, we are running this in support of the inquiry. This is designed to help the panel and the Secretariat, also designed to be thought-provoking, to share ideas, and to help some of the attendees today refine their submissions ahead of lodgement by end of Tuesday. So we want your input, and all of the input that we get by way of the interactive component will be packaged up with the rest of the material and given to the Secretariat, may be used in the submission that CIFR itself submits as well. We're looking to gauge views, perceptions about policy options and some of the observations, not all of them, but some of the observations in the interim report, and also about the direction of the inquiry, and I'll comment a little bit further about that shortly. In terms of the technology, the instructions are on page 5, as I mentioned. You do not have to log in. You do not have to submit your email address, name, etc. You can simply participate, but you need to access the link or the URL that's provided on page 5. And as I mentioned earlier, we encourage you to use the Wi-Fi and to access that site, and then you'll be in a position to simply punch in the answer when a question appears on the phone, and that will allow us to screen the real-time results from the question. You don't have to participate that way. Another way you can participate is simply to text in your response, and when we display the questions for you, there'll also be a number there that you can use to text in your input, and that will be captured as well and included in the results that we screen. So if I can just ask you to take a moment or two to set that up. I'm going to make some other remarks about the direction of the inquiry in this afternoon's session, and then I'll come back and ask a few questions by way of getting things warmed up. In the information pack that you have, there's a copy of the terms of reference and a copy of the diagram included in the interim report, which sets out the direction of the inquiry. As you know, the inquiry has invited people to critique the policy options, to propose other options, and also to engage with it on the critical matter of identifying the priorities, the top priorities, and other topics to direct attention towards between now and when the inquiry needs to submit its final report. The diagram conveys how the inquiry is going about its task. It reflects important judgments made about our financial system, for example, challenges and opportunities, principles to be satisfied for the inquiry to meet its objectives, themes, and the critical area of priorities. These judgments are obviously critical in determining where the Secretariat, the panel members, where they direct effort between now and November, and ultimately, what are the topics on which there will be recommendations made in the final report. So those judgments and the overall approach are something that we'd like you to think about through the course of today as you hear from our speakers, and we'll be asking for some views about the direction of the inquiry as well as particular topics in the interactive session this afternoon. We want to spend a little bit of time on that because obviously the way that diagram is laid out frames the public debate. It's framed the agenda today, and we want to get some feedback on that. So please think about the priority issues in particular and the approach generally ahead of that final session. And we might kick off with a question, if we can, see how many people have successfully set up their ability to participate. So this is taken from the interim report. We've got people submitting answers as I speak, and essentially it's whether you agree with what's included on the screen. I don't need to read it out. We've got voters coming in for yes. Pretty solidly in support of one of the fundamental conclusions included in the interim report. So we might just move on to the other question, and I'm sure people will join in as they can. That looks impressive, but it's not a high number of people who've read a lot of material, including the whole report. And the next question. Thanks, Veronique. There's been a lot of comment about the consultation process and the time frame, given the nature of the task, so we're keen to get a sense of the audience's views on this topic. Most thinking there has been adequate opportunity. Obviously that opportunity is live and there's time between now and the end of November. Okay, thanks. That was just to get us warmed up. If you haven't successfully signed up to participate, please do so. The next question will be asked after Professor Hilmer's presentation. With that, I hope you enjoy today's proceedings, and I ask David Gallagher to return. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, just a slight change to the program. Just before we hear David Murray speak to us, I had the great fortune to interview John Howard, former Prime Minister of Australia, and we invited him to provide his feedback on the FSI, in particular giving his perspective as a former treasurer who kicked off the Campbell Committee in the late 1970s, and then the Campbell Committee obviously reported in 1981. But obviously he's had a very long career as a politician, as a Prime Minister, and so we felt that it would be interesting to ask him his views about inquiries generally, about his perspectives about the development of the financial system in Australia and the global impact that has occurred. So I hope you enjoy the video. So, Mr. Howard, thank you so much for joining us and being prepared to talk about the financial system and developments over the last 30 plus years. Certainly, you've had a long and distinguished career, and you were treasurer at the time that the Campbell Committee kicked off its inquiry. Can you tell me a bit about the time that you've seen in terms of inquiries and the development of the financial system, but also, in your view, how frequent should these inquiries occur?
I think these inquiries should occur when they are needed. The idea that you should have routinely an inquiry every given number of years is not necessarily very sensible. The landmark inquiry in the financial system was, of course, the Campbell Inquiry, which I established as Treasurer in 1979. And of all the major inquiries into the Australian economy, none has been more comprehensively listened to than Campbell. Many of them, like the Vernon Inquiry in the 1960s, just gathered dust on parliamentary library shelves, whereas Campbell was comprehensively implemented. And that was because in time, and I stress in time, both sides of politics came to support its recommendations. When it was set up, I had in mind putting on it a group of people who believed in financial reform. I didn't see any point, as some people advised me to do, to appoint a token regulator, somebody who believed in maintaining tight government control. I thought the best way to get a sensible set of recommendations was to appoint a group of people who believed in reform and change, and that, of course, is what happened.
And certainly with the GFC, we've had a bit of a shakeout, and we've got this current inquiry. What are some of the issues that you think the current inquiry needs to really look at, in particular, given all the other previous inquiries, but post the GFC?
My starting point is that our financial system has worked very well. One of the number of reasons why we came through the GFC quite well was that our banks were very sound, well run and sensibly regulated. And our system of regulation stood up very well compared with that of other countries. So my starting point, without in any way preempting what the inquiry might recommend, my starting point is that the current system is good. And we shouldn't be complacent about it, but it is good. And we shouldn't start reinventing the wheel. The fundamentals of the system are really those laid down by Campbell. There have been changes and embellishments along the way, particularly from the Wallace Inquiry, which we set up in 1996. But the place of the various regulators that flowed out of Wallace is still there, and whilst I don't want to encroach on the territory of the present government or the present Treasurer, it seems to me that the fundamentals of our regulatory system are good and sound. That doesn't mean to say you don't change anything, but I think it's a mistake to think that we have to start all over again with financial regulation in Australia. We clearly don't.
Your long distinguished career, you've seen a lot of inquiries and no doubt had a lot of impact and in setting the terms of reference. Just in relation to your experience, how are terms of reference established and how does a government manage the policy aspects as well as the political dimension?
Well, the political dimension is something you have to handle and address when you get the inquiry's recommendations. You've got to work out what you can implement and when and how and what you can't do. My experience, and it's based entirely on Campbell, is that you provide terms of reference in a sense that point the inquiry to some degree in the direction that you want. There's no good setting up an inquiry that invites people to recommend something that you're not going to agree with. If people are likely to recommend that, well, you don't have the inquiry in the first place.
As Prime Minister, you commissioned the last inquiry, the Wallace Inquiry. It was headed up by a non-banking chair, Stan Wallace. What are the characteristics of a chair and a panel that are important in a good inquiry?
Well, you need as chairman of an inquiry a man or a woman who has a good level of common sense, who understands the business community, understands the relationship between the provision of finance and the effective operation of a business. Now, if you have those ingredients, the person doesn't have to be a banker or somebody in the financial community. Keith Campbell was a person with a background in real estate and property, but he had a very good business head. And I used to observe him on a government advisory panel in my early years as a minister, and I was mightily impressed with his grasp of business. And he understood the difficulties of financing business. He understood the relationship between business and finance. And provided you've got that, there's almost an argument for not having somebody out of the financial community to be the chairman.
In terms of the Wallace Inquiry, are there any lessons from the Wallace Inquiry and the recommendations that you think that the current inquiry needs to be familiar with or aware of?
I think David Murray and his colleagues are well aware of everything that came out of Wallace. I wouldn't seek to give them any guidance on that. I always found David Murray a very savvy banker with a remarkably good understanding of the relationship between the banking industry and the government. And I think he's alive to all of the pitfalls.
Did the Howard government introduce all of the reforms out of the Wallace Inquiry that it wanted to, or did you have a number of blockages with the Senate?
I don't think we had too many blockages with the Senate. Most of the things that we wanted to introduce, the changed regulatory arrangements, the emergence of APRA and those other things, I think we were pretty happy. There may have been one or two things that we might have wanted that we weren't able to do, but the main recommendations we were able to implement. And bear in mind that the regulatory framework that carried Australia through the GFC was the regulatory framework put in place following the Wallace Inquiry. And even the former Labor government, via the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard, acknowledged that we had a gold star regulatory system, and she said that at a meeting in 2009 in Davos. So the two principal reasons we came through the GFC so well are, firstly, as you acknowledge, the strong fiscal position that the Rudd government inherited from my government. When he became Prime Minister, we had no net debt, we had a huge amount of money in the Future Fund, and we had a budget surplus, and that meant almost without parallel anywhere else in the Western world, we entered the GFC in very strong fiscal condition. And that's not just a personal view of mine, it was the view of the Governor of the Reserve Bank only a few months after we left office. I think that's the main reason, but another major reason has to be the fortuitous resource endowment of Australia and China's demand for our resources. We were very lucky that Providence gave us all those resources and that China expanding wanted them. Now, I think they're the two main reasons. My view about the Rudd government's measures in response, I think they were overdone, unnecessary, in many cases extravagant. There were some measures that were justified and I supported, but there was too much money spent. And a lot of the money that was spent on things like pink bats and the like was really wasted and didn't really constitute the major reason why we avoided the bullet of the financial crisis.
Do you think that the response or the rapid response from the Rudd government was because of fear, or do you think it was something that was structural or strategic? Do you think that in some cases people saw the GFC and thought, goodness, this might be another 1929? Do you think that...
I have no doubt that there was an element of fear, apprehension at the time, I'm sure. That, of course, meant that there was an even heavier onus on the government to do sensible things. I accept that some measures were needed, and I accept that the automatic stabilisers of the budget would kick in. That's to be expected. But the occasion did not justify some of those measures of which I've spoken. But fundamentally, we were kept afloat by the two things I mentioned, the strong fiscal position we had when we entered, and also the huge ongoing demand for our resources by the Chinese predominantly, but not only the Chinese, also the Japanese and the Koreans.
I was living in America at the time of the GFC, and it was quite remarkable hearing about which bank might be next in terms of falling over. Certainly we're very fortunate in Australia that our banks are very big and strong and have been well regulated.
They've also been, let's be fair, well run.
Yep.
We should give some credit to the people who ran the banks at the time. It's easy to bang bankers, but we have to remember that we didn't have any of the difficulties that the Americans and the Europeans experienced. Now that has to be due to sensible regulation. It also has to be due to the quality of the leadership of the banks and also due to the general fiscal environment in which the banking system was operating.
But it goes to the question as well that we were very fortunate, and say the US wasn't as fortunate, anywhere near as fortunate as Australia. But what are your views about moral hazard and the role of the taxpayer in perhaps bailing out industries, or let's say in this case banks? What role, if any, does the taxpayer have if there's a major shock to the banking system and a bank may be in jeopardy of falling over?
You can never lay down an absolute formula for behaviour in relation to that. Having been in government, I accept that until something actually happens and you're in government and the buck has stopped with you, you don't really know precisely how you're going to react, and people shouldn't proclaim absolute purity in relation to these things without understanding that if you're faced with the choice between something going down and there being extensive chaos amongst ordinary people, it's easy to, in theory, to say, oh, well, let it all go down. In practice, it's a lot harder, but it depends a bit on the conditions that are involved. I mean, for example, in the motor car industry in the United States, there was a lot of financial help given to bail out the motor car companies, but a condition of that financial help was that the unions accepted the need for massive structural adjustment in relation to wages and working conditions. So it depends a bit on what accompanies thing. But generally speaking, I'm against governments bailing companies out, and I was very supportive of the decisions taken by the Abbott government in relation to the motor car industry and Qantas and SPC and all of those other things. I generally believe very strongly that government should not bail out companies that have failed.
There's been, you think about sort of the 1997 Asian currency crisis, and I mean, one of the things in the GFC and the subprime even before that, markets globally are increasingly co-integrated and correlated, and certainly, you know, we're so interconnected in today's day and age that any impact in one part of the global economy can have a big impact on other parts. Do you think that the benefits of closer integration globally outweigh the risks that there are to the global economy?
Well, I don't think we have an alternative. We live in a globalised economy, full stop. It's not going to change. And what we must do is to make sure it operates to the optimum benefit of all of the participants. And the first requirement of any government is to run its own domestic show properly. Because the strength of the world economy, I still believe, is the sum total of the strengths of individual economies. And the bad functioning of aspects of big economies can have a chain reaction. I'm sceptical about how many international agreements can reform the situation. I'm still a great believer that every nation should run its own economy efficiently and prudently. And if one does that, then the sum total of that good quality administration is going to produce a far better world. I mean, after all, when you look back on the financial turmoil that's occurred on occasion during the last 50 to 100 years has normally been the result of some domestic failures and bad policy implemented by individual countries. We still live in a world of nation states, and therefore it's up to every single government to run its economy efficiently and effectively.
Do you think there are any gaps in the regulatory architecture that we currently have? I mean, there's the inquiries talking about possibly separating out superannuation to have its own regulator looking after superannuation. Do you think there are any gaps?
I'd like to hear the final report views on that. I don't feel there's a strong need for still more bodies. I always start with the presumption that you don't create more regulatory authorities. Seems to me to be a contradiction in terms for a country or a government that's meant to believe in free markets to keep adding regulatory bodies. A certain level of regulation is needed, and a vigorous pursuit of fraud and dishonesty is needed, but the idea that you just regulate for the sake of regulation has never attracted me.
And lastly, just in terms of regulators, I think it was your government that ensured that the RBA was independent of political interference. Do you think that the financial regulators are sufficiently independent in making their decisions outside of government?
I am sure that the Reserve Bank is very independent. We gave it full independence in relation to the setting of interest rates. It was one of the first things that we did when the new governor, Ian Macfarlane, was appointed in 1996. There was an exchange of letters between him and Peter Costello, And that was a very important reform, and the Reserve Bank certainly exercised that independence to the full.
Competition's an important part of the financial system inquiry terms of reference. Professor Ian Harper's also undertaking a review in competition more broadly across the economy. Australia is a fairly highly concentrated market in terms of, particularly in terms of banking, wealth management. The top 10 fund managers control about 60% of assets. Do you think that Australia can do better in enhancing competition, or do you think there's a strength in having such concentration?
Well, with a country of 23 million people, there's the eternal tension between, on the one hand, sufficient strength and resilience amongst the existing players to provide confidence to consumers and to avoid unexpected collapses against the undesirability of too much concentration. There's always going to be tension at the edges. There's always going to be argument. You see it not only in the financial system, you see it every day in the retail industry, the argument about Coles and Woolworths and so forth. Now, if you listen to one side of the argument, it's very impressive, and that is, why should these two companies or four banks dominate the entire scene? It's very impressive. You listen to that, and then on the other hand, you hear the argument, well, if you're going to have good quality services in a small market, and you can't compare 23 million Australians, which is 2 or 3 million shy of the entire population of Texas in the United States, give you an idea of the comparisons, you can't expect to have the same proliferation of players. There's always going to be tension between those two things, and the role of competition policy is to provide background and guidance for that, resolving that tension, but you're never going to finish that argument. No matter what you do, you'll get people complaining about the big fellas, and equally you'll get the supporters of the big fellas saying, well, if they're not big and strong, you could have a collapse. Now, that's a simplistic way of putting it, but it's true.
Professor Fred Hilmer recently warned in a speech, UNSW, that corrupt conduct is perhaps destroying competition as much as things like price fixing. Do you think that corrupt conduct is on the rise in Australia, and what are the implications that there may be for competition?
I'm not really in a position to know whether corrupt conduct is on the rise in Australia. My instinct is that it's probably been there for some time. Whether it's a bit more widespread now because of the, I guess, the facilitation that information technology provides to certain forms of corrupt behaviour, that may be an influence, but I can't really make a declaration on that. I just am not across enough of the material to know.
And in your time as Prime Minister and post being Prime Minister, do you think that the ACCC's got enough in terms of resourcing to actually put downward pressure on prices?
Well, the ACCC and those that support it would always argue it hasn't got enough resources. That always happens. I'm always sympathetic to treasurers when it comes to regulatory bodies asking for more money. I thought my government adequately provided for the regulatory authorities. I'll leave it to others.
Are there any things in the terms of reference for the financial system inquiry that you think are missing?
No, I don't think so. I think both of them are quite. Both of those inquiries, both the one that David Murray's doing, the other one that Ian Harper's doing, are quite comprehensive, and they're both very good men, outstanding, each of them with a specialty and a background, and I'm sure that you will get from each of them high quality reports. I'm sure you will.
Your long and distinguished career, Prime Minister, Treasurer, post-Prime Minister, what are some of the things that have surprised you most about Australia's financial system over the decades that you've been in public life?
I don't know that I was surprised by it, but I was impressed by the speed with which the Australian financial system adjusted to change. There was an enormous amount of change beginning in the 70s, but it accelerated in the 80s. The financial system adjusted. It absorbed very easily the entry of overseas banks. It easily assimilated the floating of the currency, and I've been impressed with the way in which the system has adjusted. But you never want to get complacent about that. We are still too heavily regulated in many areas, but most of them are not in the financial area. They're really in areas like industrial relations, where we are still far too heavily regulated, and we really do at some stage have to address that issue, because we've gone backwards in that area over the last 6.5 years. It's the one area of the Australian economy where, apart from going from surplus into deficit, but that is a macro thing, in the micro management of the economy, the one area where we've really gone backwards is industrial relations.
You're a sports lover like I am, and Australia does punch above its weight. You look at the Olympics or even the recent Commonwealth Games, and Australia's right up there when it comes to a league table. If we look at Australia's financial system globally, where do you think we might sit on a league table?
I couldn't describe a number, but I issue a warning about league tables of comparative performance, whether it be financial systems or anything else, that usually the margin between the country that's at the top and the country